clear. Thanks for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I think I was on mute there for a second. Whoops. Anyway, I was just introducing you. You served 6 years in the Army as an Army officer. You have a master's degree at University of Houston. You've written so many books. How many have you written, man?
Let's see. I think I am up to 23 now.
Wow.
23.
That's impressive. Like when I was in college, I struggled to just make it through an essay that was like 2 or 3 pages. So I don't know how you do it, man. But I thought this would be a perfect time to bring you on and talk about the F-14 in light of Top Gun Maverick. I mean, they did something pretty amazing resurrecting the F-14. I bet that surprised you, didn't it?
Oh, it sure did. It sure did, man. I love the movie, and it brought back so many nostalgic moments for me.
What'd you think of that, the Tomcat scenes? We won't go into too many spoilers, but...
Oh, man, I got to tell you, that for me was probably the best part of the movie. I'm like, oh, score, man. I mean, for them to find a way to work that into the script, it was awesome. It really was.
It has a better screen presence than the Hornet, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. You know, I was actually surprised. You know, I saw it. I saw it soon after it came out, and a lot of the feedback that I heard from those who had seen it, on opening night, at the midnight premieres, they were saying that they didn't think it was possible, but it was actually better than the original. I said, "Come on, are you telling me it's better than the original? Can't be." But somehow I got to hand it to the filmmakers. They found a way to take the original formula and build on it. And it's one of those rare instances where the sequel is actually better than the first one. I mean, totally blew my mind.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing, man. I need to go see it a couple more times. It's definitely worth it. So, where did your interest in the F-14 start? Because this is quite an undertaking. I'll just update our audience here. We have a live chat, so you guys can ask Mike Guardia anything. We're going to talk about his book, Tomcat Theory, and he's going to tell us about it. So Ariel and I, we just finished Tomcat Theory. It was amazing. It's, like I said, quite an undertaking to essentially write a biography on the F-14. So where did this interest start? Where did the inspiration to write this come from?
Well, I think the thing that inspired me the most really was just watching the original Top Gun. So if we wind the clocks all the way back to the late 80s when I was a little kid, that was the first time that I had seen the film. And I got to tell you, I was just blown away. I mean, as far as I was concerned, the F-14 was the king of the screen, and there was no other fighter jet anywhere in the world that could match the style and grace that it really brought to that movie. And I was just blown away by the jet itself. And from that point forward, I think I was really determined to learn as much as I could about the plane. And as my writing career began to take off, I said, well, you know what? I really want to learn more about the Tomcat. And as I was gathering a lot of more books on the subject, I said, wow, I'm kind of surprised to see that there is no one comprehensive combat history that covers all of the F-14 operations in a single volume.
Right.
And I think by this point, I had about 5 or 6 titles under my belt. So I said, you know what? I haven't done too much in the realm of aviation titles, but I think that's something that I really want to take a stab at. And that's what inspired me to write the book. And it was an incredible experience. And then after about a good 4 months of really driving the pen to paper, that's when I had the first draft of Tomcat Fury.
Wow, that's incredible. So you detail all the kills scored by the American pilot. So much so you put the reader literally in the cockpit. I found it such a page turner. And I found this interesting because I didn't know much about the combat history, because I gotta admit, just from my vantage point, I think the F-15 gets most of the credit in the Gulf War.
Right.
Legendary kill ratio of 104-0. Granted, some of those from Israeli kills, but how many kills did the F-14 manage to achieve?
Okay, well, let's see. So if we're talking about the F-14 in U.S. service, it actually had a total of 5 aerial victories. You had 2 that happened in 1981 when we had the first Gulf of Sidra incident. And then you fast forward 8 years later to early spring of 1989, and you had 2 more air-to-air victories in what was the second Gulf of Sidra incident. And then 2 years after that, it's in the Gulf War, where you had an F-14 that was successful in shooting down an Iraqi helicopter. So that is a total of 5 air-to-air kills in American service, and it had more than 100 kills in Iranian service. And I say that that is a rough estimate, anywhere in the ballpark of 100 to 130, because both sides throughout the war, they were notorious for inflating their kill ratios. So
Right.
the ones that we have been able to identify have been in the ballpark of 100.
That's amazing. And I found your book one of the only ones. I think there was one from Osprey as well, but your book was one of the only ones to even detail what the Iranians did with the Tomcats, let alone just dive into it further. And I really appreciated that. So it sounds like the Iraqis, because the Iranians obviously got their kills against the Iraqi Air Force prior to the Gulf War. It sounds like the Iraqis feared the F-14, especially because of its beyond visual range capabilities.
Absolutely, yeah. Its SA capabilities were really nothing short of phenomenal. You know, I mean, it see farther, and it could also shoot farther than pretty much anything that the Iraqis had. And I think the geopolitical irony wasn't lost on anyone, because we were seeing exactly how the Soviet-built equipment was stacking up against the American-built equipment in skies over Persia. You know, you had these Persian F-14s that were going against these Iraqi MiGs, and we're like, wow, okay, we didn't have to wait till World War III to see how this would play out, because we're seeing that we're seeing that the F-14s are blowing these MiGs out of the sky left and right.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, what is the current state? And I'm sure it's really hard to ascertain this from the West, but what's the current state of the Iranian F-14s? I understand. You are airworthy. Maybe most are parked. I'm not.
Well, from what I gather, they still have a lot that are operational, but they are more or less fighting an uphill battle to keep them in the sky. The clock really started ticking against them as soon as they severed ties with the US, because here they had a whole cadre of F-14s, and they said, okay, well, we lost a lot of our technical expertise when we kicked the Americans out. We lost a lot of the best technicians, and we also lost our conduit to all of the replacement parts that we needed. So being now that we have separated ourselves from the source of our supply, well, how are we going to go about actually fixing these things and maintaining them and keeping them in the air? So they said, okay, well, there are probably 2 different ways we can do it. We can either go to the black market and try to talk to some arms dealers, you know, there's some backdoor channel surplus sales. We can do that, and we can also start fashioning the parts ourselves. And that 2-prong approach, from what I understand, worked pretty good for the next 20 to 25 years. But when the US finally retired the Tomcat, they put all the remaining Tomcat airframes through shredders. And they said, okay, if we have anything on the books that can be fashioned to be a replacement part to anything on the F-14 airframe, well, we have to get rid of that as well. So what the Iranians have been doing, I think, for the better part of the last 20 years, is that they have been trying to fashion their own repair and replacement parts for it. And you know, it's been something that they have done to varying degrees of success. And the number of airworthy Tomcats that they have on hand is, of course, a lot lower than what they started off with. You know, maybe at most you have anywhere from 12 to 24 that are in flyable condition. And it seems that with every passing fiscal year, that number starts to shrink more and more. But they have at least shown a high degree of ingenuity in, you know, trying to fashion a lot of the parts that they need to keep those airframes in the sky.
Wow, that's fascinating. Let's talk about for a second their weaponry. You mentioned, I think you mentioned in your book, the Iranians sparingly using their missiles, right? Because they had a limited number of missiles. So obviously they don't have any Phoenixes now. What do you think they arm their Tomcats with?
Well, they have a slew of homegrown missiles that they've been using for a while. They have also adapted some old Soviet armaments, you know, to be fixed on any variety of the planes that they've had. Have been ginning up whatever solutions they can come up with, pretty much whatever they can gin out of their own factories.
Yeah, makes sense for sure. Okay, I'll go to the audience here. We have a couple of audience questions. So,
okay.
Ariel notes that you've written many books on different aircraft, and she's wondering if the F-14 is your favorite fighter out of all the aircraft you've written about.
Alrighty. Well, I would say pound for pound, yes, the F-14 is my favorite, and I would say the F-15 is very, very close second.
Awesome. And then I think you answered Mike's question, but he asked, do we know how many Iranian F-14s are flyable and how they source replacement parts? Yeah,
Right.
you hit on that for sure. But see, it's something people in the West are most certainly curious about, and I found that so interesting.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the upgrade life of the F-14. So it started
Sure.
out with A, obviously, and
Right.
it had issues with its engines. Do you want to talk about some of the issues they had and how they improved it with the D? Maybe the F-14A versus the D.
Of course, yeah. So the F-14A was a fabulous airframe, but its Achilles heel was really its engine. You had the Pratt& Whitney TF-30, and it was incredibly underpowered for the airframe itself. And if you look at the statistics, most of the accidents that occurred with the F-14A during, I'd say, the first 5 or 6 years of its operational services were really due to engine failures. So by the time the F-14B and when the 14D came online, you really had a consolidated effort on the part of Grumman and the DoD to say, okay, well, we know that we made a mistake with the Pratt & Whitney engine, so how can we improve it? And that's what led to all of the engine upgrades. And once you took that X factor out of the equation, that's what really extended the serviceability and the viability of the F-14 as a whole. And when you got to the F-14D model, I mean, you really had what was by all accounts probably the best carrier-based fighter anywhere in the world. And it was a shame that it was retired when it was, because even though it was approaching what would historically have been the end of its service life, there's a certain school of thought out there that says most fighter planes can only be viable for about a lifespan of about 25 years. But just given its performance metrics, really that plane easily had another good decade or so in its in its service life before it was prematurely retired.
Right. You're talking about just how useful the D was, not just as an air superiority fighter like how it originally was designed for, but it had a great range, great payload, right?
Of course.
I read something about it being actually a superior multi-role platform in many respects compared to the F-18.
Yes, I really think that it was a shame that it was retired when it was. I easily think that it could have seen a good steady service life all the way out until the year 2016. But its days were numbered, I think, really by the end of the Gulf War. And it's kind of sad because one of the secretaries of defense that we had around that time, he really had it out for the F-14. He said that it was 1960s technology. He said that it was nothing more than a glorified jobs program. And he did everything he could really to try to shorten the lifespan of that particular fighter jet, saying that, hey, this is just excess money that we're throwing at an antiquated program. And I fully and wholeheartedly believe that the F-18 can do everything that the F-14 can do. And while it can to an extent, there is a lot to be said for the versatility of the F-14 and that it can do all jobs to a higher degree of percentage yields than the F-18 can. So
when we retired it prematurely, we knew ahead of time then that the F-18 couldn't do everything as good as the F-14. There was no question about that. Okay, so we have a couple questions here from our audience. Mike says, wasn't it Dick Cheney that shut it down?
Yeah, that was the one. Back when he was our SecDef, he was the one who put it in motion to shut it down.
That's really odd to me because usually politicians don't know a lot about military aviation. Right. So this is probably another case, is it not?
Yeah, and
good.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, and that's probably a good case for why, if you are going to put somebody as a Secretary of Defense, they should probably have some military service in their background, so they can at least think about the second and third order effects of what they're doing.
Right, absolutely. So Dan Ward shared, I've sat in the back seat of an F-14 from Strike Fighter Squadron, BFA 101, Grim Reapers in 2000 for an engine run. Coolest thing I've ever done. Then Mike,
I believe it.
Yeah, me too. I haven't had something that cool. So the last one we have for now is Damien says, hi.
Hi.
Good. So obviously the F-14 could still be very viable today in the Navy. Let's talk about, this is a really strange idea I came across. I wanted to see if you had any insights on this. Let's talk about Tomcat 21 or Super
Okay.
Tomcat 21. What can you tell us about this?
Okay, well, let's see. If we wind the clocks back to about 1998, there was a very strong movement afoot to take all of the existing F-14Ds that we had and upgrade them into something called the Super Tomcat 21. And essentially what that did is it took the airframe as it was at the time and said, okay, well, if we want to extend its service life well beyond the 21st century, here are some things that we have to do to make it competitive. And they said, okay, well, first of all, we're probably going to have to increase its payload capacity. We're probably going to have to find a way to increase its fuel capacity so we can add to the endurance of the plane. And then more than that, we also have to upgrade its electronics and its SA suite in order for it to be competitive with a lot of the latter day 4th gen and upcoming 5th gen fighters that we think are going to be on the horizon. And it was a very laudable concept, and a lot of the initial designs for the Super Tomcat 21 had a plane in mind that really didn't look anything like all of the legacy Tomcats. But, of course, being that the Tomcat was already being scheduled for retirement and a lot of our defense budgetary requirements were shifting towards other priorities, that was what eventually killed that program. And I think that Super Tomcat 21 could have been a viable platform. But there were two things that I think really would have hamstrung it. One would have been the F-35, and the other one would have been if there was a way to make it competitive with all of the 5th gen fighters as we know them today, which would mean that it would probably have to have a stealth capability attached to it. Because, even if you take the F-22 and even if you take the F-35 on their worst days, a lot of their performance metrics will just dance circles around the legacy F-14s. So.
And I actually like that, back to Top Gun, how they really gave respect to the 5th generation fighter. I wish they would have named it Su-57, but they did give
right.
Like this is a generation real deal. So
yeah,
I'm glad you brushed up on that. So I kind of wish, just as a Tomcat fanboy, they would have gone through it. That would have been so cool to see it
right.
Was that potential. Woo.
Yeah.
So with the benefit of hindsight now, was the F-14 a overwhelming success, or was it more of a bittersweet victory, like how the F-4 was? How it took us a long time to maximize the F-4's potential by gun in the E model. Because I don't know, I don't know as much about Tomcat as you, but it seems like it was a success, but it could have been so much more. What do you say about that?
Right, and that is a great question, because I actually think that it is a little bit of both. I think on the one hand, you can call it an overwhelming success because it performed its role as a carrier-based fighter. When it was pitted against enemy aircraft, it performed exceptionally well. And then on the other hand, I think you can call it a bittersweet victory because it did so well despite a lot of the bureaucratic efforts to kill it. And I also think that it performed well in light of the fact that it was pretty expensive to operate. It was an airframe that, despite being termed a fighter and an interceptor, had a very big girth to it. So I think that it really was in equal parts a tremendous success and a little bit of a bittersweet victory, to say nothing of the fact that I think that it was retired well before its time.
Wow, well, very well said.
Yeah.
Question from the audience. Was there an experience you had in the Army that fueled your love of aviation?
Probably the perennial regret that I did not join the Air Force instead.
That's funny. All right, so now for the fun part, let's talk a little bit about, so we talked about the Iranians. Let's talk about the American pilots you had a chance to review and the personnel, because I'm sure, oh my goodness, I'm sure with a book as detailed as yours was, you talked with many people who had firsthand experience with this, flying it, working on it.
Well, really the one thing that I can say about all these pilots is that they are a tremendous testament to everything that is right about America. It really seems to be that for the past 25, 30 years, there has been this overwhelming tendency to focus on everything that's wrong with America, about all these downward trajectories that our society has been taking, and about how we're lost and we're trying to find our way in the world. But when I read about all of these men and the few that I've actually had the chance to speak with, it is a very refreshing reminder to me that there's still a broad swath of our society that is not only patriotic, but incredibly competent, and that they are people that you can really rely on whenever the chips are down and the odds are stacked against you. So it's that good old-fashioned American do or die spirit that is alive and well within all of these men and women, and how that I think it is more alive and well than most people would like to acknowledge.
I love it, man. I couldn't agree more. And actually, as I read your book and many other books about great Americans and the machinery, it makes me even more proud to be American. If that's not, if that is not possible, I just look at everything. Some of these stories, like for example, you wrote on Hal Moore, one of the greatest Americans of all time, and some of your other stories. It's just like, wow, I feel it, So I get maybe that's a huge incentive for you to write some of these books to really open our eyes to what happened in our past, to highlight some of our greatest people. Because I don't know, just the Tomcat alone just makes you so proud. Like you made us. I think it was a super weapon for its day, especially.
Of course.
So I can totally see your point there. So now I'd like to detail all of the U.S. kills. We'll go through them one by one of the Tomcat. So let's start with the first Gulf of Sidra incident.
Okay.
Let's take it from the top through the end. What happened?
Sure. Okay, so you have a body of water. You can imagine the Mediterranean Sea. Up here's Italy. And then you have the coast of North Africa, and then you have Libya right here. Libya, of course, at the time was the province of Muammar Gaddafi, our favorite dictator in North Africa. So, if you take the coastal waters of Libya, he wants to take the immediate coastal waters above this country, the Gulf of Sidra, and he draws an imaginary line across it. And he says, okay, for my purposes and my purposes alone, I am going to regard everything within the Gulf of Sidra as my territorial waters. Well, he can say that all he wants to, but, whenever a ship passes through what is, deemed to be international waters, they're of course protected by international law, and the international law doesn't care about whether Colonel Gaddafi's feelings get hurt. So when he has this ongoing tension that's building, of course, every time a carrier group or anytime an American ship passes through his imaginary line of death in the Gulf of Sidra, naturally that's going to make his heart rate go up, and he's going to start his saber rattling. So what happened was, here you had in 1981, here was a carrier group that was going through the Gulf of Sidra. Okay, they certainly weren't looking for trouble. They were doing freedom of navigation exercises, and then they start getting harassed by these Libyan Sukhois. Well, if you take a Sukhoi Su-17 and Su-22, and you try to harass a flight of American F-14s, hey, I don't need to be a rocket scientist or an aviation expert to know that is not going to end well for you at all. And this was actually a pretty galvanizing moment for the American public, because this was right after Vietnam, and it also right after the hostage situation in Iran. So we needed something to feel good about ourselves. Of course, you fast forward a few years later, and all throughout the 80s, we are playing this game of cat and mouse with Gaddafi, and you have the second Gulf of Sidra. It happens in 89.
I'm curious who those Sukhoi pilots were to have the guts to take on a flight of F-14s in a Su-17. That's insane to me. I guess they didn't know. Maybe they didn't know about its capabilities, but probably. I don't care who would tell me to go for it. There's no way. That's crazy. Well, that's funny. All right, we have a question here from the audience. He said,
"Sure."
Mike says, in case of a national emergency, is it practical or possible that F-14s could be quickly re-equipped for service? And if so, how many could be put back into service?
Ooh, man, that would be a long shot. I mean, I would love to say that it would be easy to put all of our F-14s back in service, but so many of them were put through the shredder, and the few airframes that are on display, I want to say that there's a maximum of 5, and they have been completely gutted and demilitarized, to the point where, I think it would be quite a chore to put them back into service. Not saying that it's impossible, but just knowing how the federal government works, they would probably take one look at the cost sheet and say, okay, well, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and would probably be a monumental task. Yeah.
Yeah, that's too bad because
Yeah.
the imagination he loves to run wild and think about us
Oh, right.
hard time rearming ourselves with dozens of F-14s. It'd be so cool from the boneyard. But it makes sense because they destroyed them, they shredded them because Iran's now
Right.
right. So they didn't want black market parts getting funneled to Iran. Yeah, I remember reading something about that. That's too bad. So it got Tomcat got the first 2 kills, the first Gulf of Sidra in American hands. Second 2 kills following Gulf of Sidra incident.
Right.
What about? Let's talk about its last kill under American colors.
Right. So that actually happened in the Gulf War, and it only had one air-to-air kill throughout the entirety of the Gulf War, and it was a little bit of a humorous footnote because it was one of the few times where an American plane was credited with downing an enemy helicopter. I think to an extent, when a lot of the naval squadrons deployed and F-14s were going airborne, that they were expecting to see a repeat of what they had seen on the movie screens in Top Gun, that there would be these epic dogfights, and it would be the F-14 scoring all of these aerial victories against MiGs. And while a lot of those dogfights played out, they played out with pretty much exclusively the F-15s making all of those aerial kills. So it was definitely an aerial victory that the F-14 earned, and it was also certainly interesting because they downed a helicopter. But it always tended to be that most of the missions that the F-14 found itself doing, they were doing recon missions, or they were they were assigned to do escort runs, or they were just doing ground attack missions.
Man, this just goes to show how powerful the American forces were. I mean, the F-15 took care of the job, but I don't doubt for a second that the F-16s behind the F-15s couldn't have pulled off the same results. And the Tomcats from the carrier forces,
right.
That's a lot of bristling with firepower. So
yeah.
All right, let's talk about combat losses. So
okay.
An F-14 was never shot down in an air-to-air fight under America, and flying under the U.S. But there were some F-14s lost from certain air threats. Correct?
Yeah.
That's hard. I mean, I've spoken with pilots who they say the surface-to-air threats nowadays way worse than anything they could imagine. So I mean, I understand, but wasn't there an F-14 in the Gulf War lost by SA-2, or how many? Actually?
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, there was a 14 that was shot down by an Iraqi surface-to-air missile. And it was unfortunate, of course, in the fact that we lost that F-14, but it was at least a half victory that both pilots were recovered, and that really both of those pilots had survived to tell the tale. Both pilots ejected, but of course, in the fog of combat, and also the aerodynamics of the parachutes, they start to drift apart from each other. They land within miles of each other, but they trail off in different directions. One is able to evade capture, but the other one is unfortunately captured, and he is detained in Baghdad alongside a slew of other coalition pilots. And it's quite an ordeal for him in the midst of an Iraqi POW camp. And he said he was going on the record to say that I was deathly afraid that I wasn't going to survive this ordeal, because I had heard so many stories about what our pilots in Vietnam and World War II had endured at the hands of enemies while as a guest of these POW camps. And he said that his experiences were in a lot of ways reflective of what his forebears had endured, because he was denied basic care. He was put on these starvation rations, and he had a whole laundry list of all of these health problems that he developed from his time in a POW camp that that he was plagued with for the rest of his life.
Right. And how was the other down pilot rescued? Because I recall this is quite an amazing story.
Oh, it was. So he was able to make radio contact with Air Force Pararescue Unit, and they were the ones who facilitated his extraction.
Wow, that's That's so incredible. That sounds like that could be a movie in and of itself right there.
It is.
All right, so that's actually a really good kill record. So we lost one F-14 in combat as Americans,
Hmm.
basically, and a bunch probably in crashes, obviously,
Right.
especially with the old TF-30 engines. I read like when F-14s would launch, the worst case scenario is having an engine failure right after launch, especially if you're fully loaded.
Right.
Like, recovery was really difficult. So, okay, let's talk about some close calls that the F-14 had, or maybe not for the Tomcat, but for the enemies that they faced.
Hmm.
Wasn't there a, wasn't there, weren't there, I should say, close calls by Vietnam after the Vietnam War? Didn't weren't the F-14s that encountered MiG-23s, and there was it looked like for a second it might be another Gulf of Sidra incident?
Right, right. So there is one incident in particular that stands out in my mind. And if we wind the clocks back to 1987, this is towards the tail end of the Cold War. And, you had these carrier groups who were doing the regular variety of these freedom of navigation exercises. One particular F-14 squadron that was running these combat air patrols off of the coast of Vietnam. Now, of course, this is after the Vietnam War, and Vietnam as a republic has been reunified. It's now under communist control, and the Soviets were pretty good use of the air bases there. They were also flying these regular patrols out of the air bases in Vietnam, and you have this one incident that happened in 1987 where you had a flight of F-14s intercept a MiG-23 that was piloted by a Soviet aviator. A treat for the F-14 crews, because it was rare that you ever got to see a Soviet plane that was being driven by a Soviet pilot. In one of the close encounters that they had, they could tell that it was a Soviet MiG because it had the unmistakable red star on the fuselage. And they said, at first we could tell that he was a rookie pilot because he was making a lot of the rookie mistakes that you would expect to see out of an aviator who was fresh out of flight school. So they said it was interesting to see that. And then they also said sometime later we had another close encounter with a MiG pilot who would turn away from us, but then he would reverse course and he would vector back to our position. So we were getting kind of tired of this game of cat and mouse, and we're thinking to ourselves, okay, what is this guy's intentions? He's sampling us, he turns away, and then he turns back. What is on this guy's mind? So what we did was we came up behind him, and he obviously knew that we were there because he started modulating his afterburners from off to full thrust, and he was sending up his flaps and slats like this as if he was trying to send some semaphore signals. And from what we could deduce, he was probably telling us to back off. But what we did was we got right up on his wing, and I looked across the cockpit. I could see him, and it was like the first time I was generally face to face with a Soviet aviator. But the biggest takeaway was not only was he shocked to see me, but he had this weird looking handlebar mustache. I was like, wow, I didn't think Soviet pilots could do that. But yeah, so apparently this close encounter was enough to shake the Soviet pilot. And he vectored off of the wing, and we could see on the radar that he was landing back at Cameron Bay. But they said that it was a weird incident because we were a little bit apprehensive, thinking it was going to be a repeat of the Gulf of Sidra. But not only did we get to see an actual Soviet MiG up close in a place that's very far away from the Iron Curtain, but we also got to see, these Soviet pilots have very peculiar standards when it comes to facial hair.
That's funny. Maybe a Robin Hood example was contagious with them. This
Probably.
is funny. It's like a real life version of Mavericks and Goose's encounter with the MiG-28.
Yeah.
All he had to do is flip that guy off, and it would have been a perfect.
Right.
That's really cool. So, okay, we talked about the fun part, the air-to-air history of the Tomcat, but I think this is worth mentioning too. Let's talk about the air-to-ground history of the Tomcat.
Sure.
So originally it was designed purely as an air superiority fighter, correct, with the A, but when did it start to switch from air superiority platform to multi-role platform?
Well, I think the big shift really started towards the end of the Gulf War, because I think at that point, everyone was of the mindset that, air-to-air threats aren't quite what they used to be. The Soviet Union has gone the way of the dinosaur, and the overwhelming victory that we had in Desert Storm is pretty much a clear indication that nobody can really challenge American pilots in the sky. So they think, okay, well, now that we're shifting towards more of a constabulary role, now that we're shifting towards more peacekeeping operations, like Somalia, Haiti, and Bosnia, we really need to make sure that pilots are multifaceted, and we need to make sure that they're good at doing, all these reconnaissance missions and air-to-ground missions, because for the foreseeable future, that's probably what we're going to, that's probably what's going to keep us busy. So that was when I think the big shift started, and you really start to see the downstream effect of that when our pilots doing these reconnaissance run over Bosnia, because that was almost exclusively an air-to-ground mission in its earliest days. It was trying to do recon missions. It was trying to do these air-ground liaison missions to the peacekeepers that we had on the ground. And it was that shift, I think, that really started to get the pilots in the mindset of, okay, well, we need to keep a core competency of air-to-air in the back of our minds, but we need to develop how to sync our operations with all of these assets on the ground. We need to learn a different lingo. And to an extent, you also saw that play forward in the opening days of Afghanistan, because as we were going against all of these Al-Qaeda and Taliban targets on the ground, when you look at the Tomcat's operational history throughout the opening days of Enduring Freedom, that is exclusively what they were doing. They were engaging these cave complexes, they were engaging convoys, they were trying to hit all these points of infrastructure. And it was really just another testament to how brilliantly these pilots performed, and just how versatile that they could be whenever the situation called for it. Because a lot of the pilots who were running these ground attack operations in Afghanistan, they were the generation who grew up with Top Gun, and they were expecting to have dogfights with MiGs and Sukhois, but they said, okay, well, this kind of war is different, and we really have a different face of warfare now. So, if I can't shoot down a MiG-28, then maybe I can give hell to Johnny Al-Qaeda on the ground.
Yeah, that's awesome. So were they? I guess what I'm curious about is, were they heavily used in the air-to-ground role, or were they or is that an uncommon mission and F-18s were usually picking up that role?
Well, you really had the F-14s that were carrying a very heavy swath of the operational load there. It was understood at this point that the Tomcat was pretty much in the twilight of its life. So they said, okay, well, since we know that the Tomcat isn't going to be around for too much longer, let's go ahead and use it for a role that we know qualitatively it does well, because they were going back to what they had seen throughout the Bosnia conflict. And they said, okay, well, if it's good for all of these ground attack missions, we'll use that as a ground attack platform. And of course, we'll still use the F-18, but the one qualitative advantage that we have in using the F-14 for this role is that we know that it doesn't need as short of a tether, and it can stay a lot longer than the F-18 can.
Right. That totally makes sense. Some of our Hornet fans here might get upset, but hey, it's hard to compete with the awesomeness of the F-14. All right, so we're getting close to wrapping this up. We do have an audience question. How did the Tomcat get its name?
All righty. So this is actually a little bit of history and a little bit of backhanded comedy. If we were to take the Grumman Aerospace Corporation and we were to look at their history of naming their planes, they had a habit of naming a lot of their fighter planes after felines. If we go back to World War II, we had the Hellcat, and they also said, okay, well, we have this new fighter that's coming on board and we have won the contract for it. So what can we do to build the tradition of naming our planes after felines, yet maybe put a little bit of humor in there too? So at the time, one of the F-14's biggest champions was a Navy admiral whose first name was Thomas. And they said, okay, well, Tom's cat. Okay, Tomcat. Hey, you know what? We can kill two birds with one stone that way, because a Tomcat is a male cat, who's typically tough. He's a fighter, right? But hey, we can also say that this is Tom's cat because he's been the guy who's been pushing for this program for so long. So you know what? Hey, Tom, congratulations. You just had a plane named after you, and we get to keep our tradition. And if anyone gives us too much grief about it, we have plausible deniability, because we already have a history of naming our fighter planes after cats. And we can just say, oh, well, you know what? That's a coincidence. We just said, hey, Hellcat, Tomcat. Oh, hey, you know what? His name's Tom. It's completely inconsequential.
Wow, that's a great story.
Yeah,
Didn't even know that. That's awesome.
yeah.
So okay, we've had a lot of people watch this. So where can we purchase Tomcat Fury? I assume Amazon.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So you can buy Tomcat Fury pretty much anywhere books are sold. You buy it from Amazon. I think it's probably the quickest way to get it. You can also get it from Barnes and Noble. You can get it from Books a Million. If we have any e-readers out there, it's also available on Kindle. So it is available across a variety of formats.
Awesome. We're gonna link it in the comments so everyone can upload it. I highly recommended it. We loved it. My